afternoon. It's with pleasure that we welcome you to this webinar called Between Crisis and Opportunity, the pandemic's implication on the economic and energy sectors in the broader Mediterranean. It's a meeting organized as a regional meetings of Med Dialogues 2020 in cooperation with the European University Institute under in the framework of the State of the Union 2020, which this year was also devoted to the issue of the consequences of the pandemic's COVID-19. So it's a great pleasure today to have a distinguished group of panelists. I'm going to introduce them briefly. I will unfortunately also have to notice that Dr. Fernando Gentilini and Dr. Wolf, the managing director of EIS MENA, and Dr. Wolf from Bruegel will not be able to join us. So we will have more time for the discussion with the three panelists, and I'm going to introduce them now. It's Daniel Lederman, lead economist and deputy chief economist, Middle East and North Africa at the World Bank. Then Dr. Fahad Al-Turki, vice president and head of research and King Abdallah Petroleum Studies and Research Center in Saudi Arabia. And Dr. Karim Al-Naiwi, President and Policy Center for the New South in Rabat, Morocco. So I will, following this order, I will now start the meeting, just introducing the topic. I think we all been following with great concern the developments over the past 3 months. The pandemics have been spreading throughout the world and has had a number of important effects, both on the health, of course, primarily, but also immediately in parallel on the economies of most of the globe. And we are now obviously looking with quite a lot of preoccupation about what the future might bring us, particularly in the short and medium term, but also perhaps even in the longer term. In the MENA region, of course, the industrial production and trade flows, as in many other parts of the world, have been severely carved by the double crisis, or I would even say triple crisis, of the pandemics, which has been coupled with, of course, the immediate impact on the economies, and also with the parallel crisis brought by the collapse in oil prices. So we have a scenario in which the economic situation of the global economy is quite uncertain, and that creates some questions about how the economies in the MENA region are going to react, knowing that they have been marked over the past several years, but important vulnerabilities, and that, of course, gone in parallel with a number of questions in the socio-political area, which have already been strained by increasing grievances on socio-economic issues, and demand of empowerment, protest, especially the demands of the younger generation, which struggles in finding perspective and prospects in the MENA economies. So we will try to cover all these issues. I will now pass the floor to the panelists that will introduce the different aspects. Then we will have hopefully a couple of rounds of questions. So I remind our audience that they will be able to pose questions in the Q&A modality of the platform, and so that we will be selecting some of those. We already have a few questions that have reached us beforehand, and so I'm looking forward to a very lively discussion. To start, I will turn to Daniel Lederman. Daniel, you have recently produced a very interesting report on transparency in the MENA region. Of course, I'm sure this is had been prepared even before the crisis, the pandemic crisis manifested itself, but it becomes even more interesting in the framework of what is happening today. Can you enlighten us about how the dual crisis, the economic and oil price crisis, combined with the pandemics in affecting the MENA region economies, and what we can expect in terms of short-term growth perspective and as well as longer-term issues affecting the various economies of the region.
Well, thank you very much, Luigi, for the kind invitation to be with everybody today. I'm going to share now my screen. I have a few slides prepared. Let's see. All right. Can you guys see it?
Yes.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you, Luigi, for mentioning our report that we published at the beginning of April that was is titled How Transparency Can Help the Middle East and North Africa. Well, it is true that most of the research was performed prior to the onset of the current crisis. We did dig in chapter 1 a little bit into thinking through the economic and social consequences of the crisis. And we have a central argument in that chapter, which is about the costs of the dual shock. And the reason we purposefully talk about a dual shock, singular, is because we believe that the collapse of oil prices is related to the pandemic, meaning that global demand for energy collapsed as the pandemic spread, and the large economies of the world, starting with China, then Western Europe, then the United States, went into a series of lockdowns. This exacerbated the decline in demand for energy, and the oil producers of the world were unable to counteract the collapse in demand. Today, we have some of the world's leading experts, a leading expert in oil markets, but let me just share with you a couple of ideas. All right, let me see. So this is just I'm gonna go briefly through an explanation of what we mean by the dual shock. So I just have a picture from the New York Times as of May 8th that shows the outbreaks as of May 8th around the world. The issue is that when China's outbreak started and spread through Europe, and then through Europe and through China onto the United States on both coasts, that led to policy responses around the world that entailed severe reduction in economic activity, which translated into a collapse in global demand for energy, which then led to a fundamental change in global oil markets. In this graph, what we're plotting is the spot prices from January 2018 to the most recent data that we had as of early this week. And then the blue line was the futures curve as of January 21, 2020. The yellow line was the futures oil price curve as of September 2019. So you can see that markets had not internalized what was going on until after late January. Fast forward to March 9th, 2020, and May 7th, 2020, you can see how the futures curves had collapsed, even though the futures traders are in effect predicting a gradual recovery of the price of oil for delivery in well into the end of 2022. And so both things are related. The onset of the pandemic, the collapse in demand for oil, and the collapse that brought about the collapse in prices. Now, here, there's another interesting graph that I would like to share with our audience today. The World Bank, like the IMF and private banks around the world, do frequent forecasting of what's going to happen around the world. In our office, together with our World Bank economists that are spread throughout the region, we perform periodic assessments of our expectations for economic activity throughout the MENA region. And so what this graph is showing is the difference in our GDP growth forecast that we had published in October 2019, well before we knew anything about the pandemic, and as of April 1st, 2020. So it's the difference between those two forecasts. Here we've plotted those differences for 4 countries: Egypt, Lebanon, Morocco, and Saudi Arabia. This is the curve of those differences, or changes in forecast of GDP growth for Lebanon. You can see that in April, not only have we revised our expectations for growth in Lebanon, in fact, we downgraded our expectations of growth in Lebanon by 11 percentage points, 11.2 to be more precise. But we had also reassessed what had happened back in 2019, because Lebanon was, before the current crisis, facing challenging economic, but particular macro-financial issues that had already affected their last quarter growth performance in 2019. Okay, then here's Morocco. Our forecasts relative to October were downgraded to the tune of 4.5 percentage points. But we expected in April 1st a relatively fast recovery for Morocco, expecting that it'll grow in 2021 faster than we had previously expected way back then in October. For Saudi Arabia, the expected decline in growth was a little bit more attenuated. And for Egypt, it's important to remember that the national statistics of Egypt follow their fiscal year, which ends in June of 2020. So most of the effect of the crisis is occurring from their point of view in the last quarter, in the last 3 months. So that's why the growth downgrade in our expectations for 2020 is relatively modest at around 2 percentage points of GDP. However, you can see that we expect that our expectations for growth in Egypt in 2021 were also downgraded, and that's because the 2021 fiscal year in Egypt begins July 1st. So some of the costs appear as 2021, but it's just an issue of the timing of the reporting. Now, why am I showing you this graph? Because the crisis hasn't fully materialized itself. We're barely in May of 2020, and we need to forecast or form certain economic expectations about what's going to happen in the remainder of the year and well into 2021. And the reason this graph is interesting is because when you compare economic expectations before the crisis took place to new economic expectations after we have some information of what's happening on the ground, that difference is arguably a proxy, a good estimate of the expected aggregate economic costs of the dual shock, meaning the pandemic, the policy response to the spread, and the collapse of oil prices. Now, all of these expectations or estimates of the economic costs of the crisis are highly fluid and changing on a weekly basis, if not on a daily basis. I'd like to share 4 messages. First is the one that I just insinuated, that changes in expectations are arguably estimates of the expected cost of the crisis. Let me give you an example, a very stark example. The IMF, in its latest World Economic Outlook, revised its expectation. It had published an estimate of the global economic growth in January, and in which they said they expected the economy of the world to grow by 3.3 percentage points. In late April, they published a revised version of those global expectations, and now they were saying that they expected the global economy to contract by 3%. The difference between those two numbers is 6.3 percentage points, and that's a good proxy of the IMF's expected costs for the globe as a whole of the crisis. In our own report, we compare our previous expectations of growth for the whole region, for MENA as a whole, and in October, we were saying that we expected 2020 to be a slow growth, but in recovery mode for the region of 2.6 percentage points. Now, as of April 1, in our report, we published an estimate of minus 1.1%. The difference is 3.7 percentage points for the region. If you interpret that as our expected costs, aggregate costs for the region as a whole of the dual shock, as of the information we had in April 1st, that 3.7 percentage points of the region's 2019 GDP adds up to over $110 billion. And we've been tracking private sector forecasts and comparing the private sector forecasts for the region relative to what they were saying in December, and those numbers are getting bigger and bigger. So a key issue to remember is that uncertainty rules, because in order to get a good, precise forecasts of what the costs are going to be of the spread and of the collapse in demand for oil and many other goods and services such as tourism that are important for the development and growth of the region, one would need to forecast what's going to happen in the rest of the world, what policies are going to be implemented in China, in Western Europe, in the United States going forward. Then we need to predict what are going to be the national policy responses, both in terms of public health interventions, social distancing policies, but also in terms of macroeconomic and fiscal and social policies. And it's very difficult to predict what's going to happen. And importantly, and that's why we argue that transparency is now at a premium during the crisis and beyond. Because in order to really assess what the aggregate costs are going to end up being through 2020 and well into 2021, we would need also to assess or predict how societies are going to respond to the economic shocks as well as to the public health interventions. And so there's high uncertainty about how societies are going to respond. Will they follow the instructions of the central government, or will they go their own way? That is virtually impossible, particularly for economies, to predict. So the uncertainty rules. However, just because our precise estimates or expectations of the aggregate costs are uncertain, that doesn't mean that we don't know the direction of those costs. They're negative. As time goes by, I think that economies will revise their expectations downwards, at least for 2020. Now, not only do we know the direction, although not the precise magnitudes of the costs, we do know from our research presented in our report, and I have some slides that if I have time I will share, that show that the expected aggregate costs across countries in MENA is highly correlated with the pre-crisis indicators of the quality of the public health systems. That is why in the previous graphs that I show you, for Saudi Arabia, in spite of being more exposed as a share of GDP by the oil shock, by the collapse of oil prices, it has a world-class public health system that will allow it, we believe, in the medium to long run, to come out from an economic standpoint less scarred than countries where the public health systems were less prepared. Unfortunately, the greatest concern in terms of the capacity of the public health systems to absorb the shock is worse in conflict-ridden economies than in developing or high-income economies of the region. Now, in terms of national policy responses, we are arguing
Daniel,
for
you have 2 minutes.
2 minutes. I'm just going to finish here. We're arguing for a sequencing of policy responses, but a sequencing without delay. What does this mean? Because it sounds like an oxymoron. We believe that the first priority in the current crisis situation should be addressing the public health crisis. This requires hopefully smart use of social distancing policies, combined with testing to the extent that it's available relatively widely, with transparent sharing of information, both about the spread, about the economic costs, and about the policy intentions and the reasons for the policy intentions of sharing that set of information with the broad civil society, so that everybody can be on the same page by minimizing uncertainty of what are the social objectives and what we're trying to accomplish. However, it is true that not just in Lebanon, but across the board in the developing countries of MENA, and even in the high income economies of the GCC, there were policy challenges that predated the onset of the crisis. So the trick is to shift gears, get into crisis mode, protect lives, protect livelihoods to the extent that's possible to protect them in the current crisis situation with shrinking fiscal space, but to begin thinking immediately about the future that we want to build across MENA after the pandemic subsides. And that requires planning, and it requires planning to chart a clear path, a transparent path to building trust with broader civil society and the citizenry of the region, so that once the crisis mode subsides, we can get on with rebuilding these economies in a new way that offers enhanced trust in the public sector from the point of view of the citizenry, and prepare to do the needful things and the reforms that will be different than the reforms we were expecting in October and December. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Daniel. Of course, a lot of uncertainty and difficulties in planning appropriate responses, but obviously the question of getting it right in the sequence and getting it quickly and flexibly, it's key. And obviously the question of transparency plays an important role. We're probably returning to this topic. I will now turn to Dr. Fahd if you can shed some light on the energy dimension of the crisis. Of course, energy, oil and gas revenues are extremely important in the region, as we all know, both in oil-producing countries, but also for non-oil producing countries in terms of the impact on remittances, transfers, and so forth and so on. So what are the reverberations of the present oil crisis shock, which is, as we know, linked to the pandemic? So now you see this developing both in countries like Saudi Arabia, who have important vision 2030 to implement, and in countries that, of course, do not have the oil riches at the disposal of their economies to play a role in their fiscal space.
Thank you for the introduction and the invitation. I would like to say that while this panel, the topic of this panel is the implication of the pandemic on the economy and energy, I would like to note that the COVID-19 pandemic, above all, is a human tragedy, and perhaps is the most significant civilizational threat that we have faced in our life. COVID-19 has now spread to more than 4 million people in more than 180 countries, a rate of infection that we have never seen in more than a century. There is a significant challenge to even well-funded healthcare system that is now currently struggling to keep up with the spread of the virus across the globe. So while we discuss the economic and the energy impact, we also need to keep that in mind at the same time. Economically, the socio-economic impact of this pandemic is tremendous and huge. And we saw Daniel talked about the global growth being negative this year, -3, compared to a 3 point something earlier in the year, positive. So there is a reduction of 6 percentage points. I would say even next year, we would likely to see a stagnation of growth. Even though the IMF forecasts about 4 or 5% growth next year, I think that is very optimistic. I think the ramification of this pandemic is likely to carry on with us into next year, especially that unemployment is rising significantly in many countries, advanced and developing countries. SMEs are going out of business, and also not only SMEs, we keep on hearing about even large companies facing difficulties with their cash flow. It's only recently where some countries started to think about restarting the economy. China, the US, there have been a lot of thinking about moving and opening the economies within the next few weeks and few months. But even though from my perspective as an economist, I think starting a business, opening a store is way easier than reinstating confidence among consumers and also restarting aggregate demand. So there will be a very challenging environment ahead of us across all sectors, not only on the energy side. Beside the immediate impact on health, if we turn to the economy, and the impact of the pandemic has been huge on the economy, the energy use, the CO2 emissions, and so on. In fact, CO2 emissions is likely to decline this year by 9% compared to last year. And also, according to the IEA, countries in full lockdown are expecting an average of 25% decline in their energy demand. Countries with partial lockdown have seen their energy demand drop by 18%. If we look at the actual data for the first quarter, we will see that demand for energy dropped by 3.8%. And this is for the first quarter, where the impact was severely in China throughout the quarter, but also during March, when many countries in Europe, North America, Middle East, and elsewhere have started to control movements of their citizens. For overall the year 2020, this current year, the IEA is expecting demand to fall by 6%, basically wiping off a 5 year of demand growth that we saw over the past 5 years. And this is the largest decline in demand that we see in 70 years. So a massive reduction. If we turn our attention to the impact on breakdown by fuel, we see that, interestingly, the low carbon fuels, and in particular natural gas, nuclear, and renewable, seems to be more resilient to the downturn compared to coal and oil. And this is something, I think it's an important message, that we need to build a resilient and sustainable economic future after the pandemic. Demand for coal was hit hard by the first quarter, declining by around 8% compared to last year. There are three reasons why there is a significant drop in demand for coal. First is China, where it's a coal-based economy, which is the hardest hit country in the first quarter by the pandemic. And second is the competition coming from cheap gas and continued growth of renewable is also capping the demand for coal. In addition to this, seasonal factors like mild weather also cap demand for coal. We look at the natural gas. Natural gas also, as I mentioned, seem to be more resilient than other sources of fossil fuel. The IEA projects that demand will still fall by around 5% this year compared to last year. However, there is a different forecast within the market and a great level of uncertainty related to where natural gas is likely to land in terms of growth and for demand on natural gas, from being flat this year compared to last year to seeing a positive growth of 4%, and this was projected by Platts. But even any of these numbers is significantly lower than last year, which saw demand for natural gas increasing by 11%. If we look at the oil, and I would take about 5 more minutes to focus on the oil, given that it received a lot of attention in the last few months. According to our estimates, which we have published in the first week of May, so 2 weeks ago, we see the fall in demand in the first quarter to be around 14.3 million barrels per day. And we expect the yearly decline in demand for this year to be around 7.3 million barrels per day. And as we noted, this is the largest decline in demand for oil to be ever recorded. And if we look at, and probably this is why the oil market received a lot of attention in the media over the last few months, in addition to the discussion about the OPEC agreement and the OPEC Plus agreement that fall apart in March and then reinstated in early April. Most of the discussion in the media was focusing on most of the headlines, more focusing on the demand side. It's always a demand side story, given the pandemic and the COVID-19 impact on different economies. If we look at the statistics, supply in April increased by no more than 3 million barrels per day, following the collapse of the deal. While demand for the same period, April, fell by 30 million barrels per day. So it is a massive demand decline relative to an increase in supply. There is, though, a positive sign in this dynamic, and I think this speaks to many of the economies within the region. Now, a well-supplied and cheap oil market will definitely help restart the economic engine, especially for oil importing countries, not only in the region here, but also for large economies like China and India. This is important if we are thinking about restarting the global economy and reversing this minus 3% to a positive number next year, especially that the oil importing countries' share in the global GDP outweighs that of the oil exporting countries. And in fact, we've seen some countries, there are some reports that shows as China comes back to or restart the economy, taking advantage of such low oil prices. Some reports mentioned that 95% of large factories resumed operation in China since March. And even more significant and related to the energy market, some reports are showing that oil imports for the first week of March are back to the pre-outbreak volume, above 10 million barrel per day. What does this mean for the oil market? Probably it means a V-shaped recovery in some fuels, especially diesel and gasoline demand moving forward. Though this does not factor in the risk of a second wave of COVID-19 that is being talked about in the media and also among some research centers that focus on this area that is likely to happen within the next fall. Overall, if we exclude that, our expectation is that demand is likely to be down for this year by 7.3 million barrel per day, before rebounding by 5.5 million barrel per day next year. On the supply side, the huge OPEC plus supply cut and also the North America production losses during the last few months are likely to push supply back in line with demand, but not until next quarter. Our expectation is that the global supply will be falling by 7.3 million barrel per day this year, which will help stabilize prices and probably push or put prices on an a gradual upward trajectory, which if you look at prices today, we've seen an increase in Brent above the $30. Though the whole dynamic of the oil market is causing a massive losses in major oil producing companies. If we look at the stock market, we see that global oil super majors are witnessing an erosion of their market capitalization by 40 to 50% over the last 6 months. So a major challenge for many oil producing companies. Even in addition to this, in addition to this, the market, the liquidity in the market has been very tight, which might reflect a major impact on the supply and the value chain in the moving forward. On balances, I think even though the OPEC plus agreement will help in avoiding a worst case scenario for the oil market, it is not going to be enough to restore market balances in the second quarter. We might see some improvement in the third quarter. So this is because of the buildup in the inventories as well as absolute volumes, and will result in a deep discounts and shut-ins as operators are unable to find buyers for their oil or for their crude. The next few months are going to be extremely challenging for the oil market industry. And if the pandemic continues, the challenge will continue down the road. And if we look at the implication on COVID-19 on capital investments within the industry, which have declined significantly this year, I think there is a major challenge in terms of ability of the market to supply and meet demand in the future years. I would like to end with a positive sign that we've seen emerging as demand losses are subsiding and global activity is improving. If we see the COVID-19 infection curve flatten, then probably the industry will avoid a significant implication of this pandemic. So thank you, and back to you.
Thank you, Dr. Fad. I take notice of the bright side of the rather gloomy picture that, of course, a well-supplied market, oil market can potentially facilitate the restart of economies, even though probably there are more structural factors in the aggregate demand that will play a role globally. But also, I'm sure that we will be interested in looking at various aspects of the resiliencies of certain energy markets like nuclear, renewable, but we get back to that afterwards. I will now turn to Karim, and I'd like to ask you to get a bit more on the socio-economic intersection of the COVID-19 pandemics and the consequences on the young generation and the new social contract for the region. I think there are quite a number of potential socio-political implications from the pandemics, and they get inserted into trends that we have been witnessing over the past years. So, how do you see the situation on that front?
Thank you, Luigi, and it's a pleasure to be with you all. Let me maybe start from the viewpoint of what we see here in Morocco, and then try to answer your question. Basically, I would like to structure my input on four dimensions. The first one will be where we were when it started. What was the situation? And I will tell you about Morocco, but I can say a bit more about the region in general. And also what's going on in terms of the economy. What is the impact? And I'll say a few words about also in terms of how it is affecting the various components of population. And then what kind of policies, that will be the third point, are being done. And then I'll conclude on the political economy of reforms and what it means, and how, let's say, we can use the crisis to create a sort of momentum for reform, and what it will take. And I think it's something that would be both true for this side of the Mediterranean, but also for the European Union, I guess. So the first point where we are, we never recovered from the financial crisis, basically. We never fully recovered from the financial crisis. And basically, we've lost 1.5 percentage points of GDP permanently, which is the potential growth has reduced. We've never recovered because also the elasticity of GDP growth to employment has been low and stubbornly low for a couple of years, which is a case in many countries as well. From that standpoint, we never recovered. Central bank balance sheet never recovered. That's a lie to say central banks have recovered. We never got out of quantitative easing, including particularly in advanced economies. Debt is still very high. We never recovered in terms of the debt, of levels of debt. Look at the G20 level of average GDP debt. We never recovered. We never recovered also in terms of in terms of trade, basically, and protectionist sort of trade wars, which are for me consequences of the financial crisis. So basically, we were in a sort of transitional period all around the world, and that's true also for many countries of this region. And if you add to that conflict, of course, if you add to that geopolitical interactions, power rivalries, countries like Libya, or of course east, you see that really we never recovered. And these are all interlinked dimension and aspects of things. They're not isolated. And I can do a long list. In Morocco, we had several shocks, of course, and the financial crisis. Then came the Arab Spring, 2011, and a couple of other idiosyncratic and domestic originated shocks. So basically, when the crisis hit, the margins were already quite eroded, but there were still some margins because in terms of fiscal policy, we had rebuilt some of the margins, since 2014. So this pandemic happens, and we create, because of the policies, basically, it's a man-made engineered crisis because of confinement policies that we've basically stopped the economies all around the world. And of course, it's a very powerful sort of policy because there are many transmission channels and they are compounded each other's. I mean, if Morocco stops basically traveling and of its own citizens, the others are not coming as tourists to Morocco. Foreign demand is collapsing for Morocco, and then you have these cards of path dependency and self-reinforcing sort of dynamics. So we are affected through, of course, remittances that are lower but quite resilient in Morocco. And of course, the tourism sector is one of the, I would say, of the strongest channel of transmission because it's highly intensive in unskilled labor. It affects employment quite significantly. That's a very strong one. We are, unlike my friend Fahad, we are positively affected by lower oil prices because Morocco has no oil production, so it's a net importer. So for us, it's a very positive shock on the terms of trades. And we estimate that number by 3%, 2 percentage points of GDP as a positive shock to the economy. Earlier on in the decade, there was again another positive shock, which was about 4 percentage points of GDP. So for Morocco, it's a very strong and important transmission challenge, particularly on the sustainability of external accounts. We estimate that we lose about 3.2 percentage points of GDP every month of confinement here in Morocco. Basically, the nature of the confinement, we have estimated this very detailed exercise by regions and by sectors, that every month we lose 3 percentage points. So I concur with Daniel, and I'm glad to see that the World Bank has revised its provision on Morocco. It was minus 1.9 a couple of weeks ago, which was not realistic. And I see that here you have minus 4% or something, if I read correctly the table. That's what we have for Morocco for this year. Basically 2-3 months, that's minus 12, minus 6, plus 3 of which is the base sort of baseline growth. So we're losing basically 6% of GDP this year. That's a very strong shock to the economy, and it's a particularly strong shock on, of course, the informal sector, on laborers and vulnerable workers. We're talking about 4 to 5 million people that are seriously affected, and that could, of course, we have to be careful that they don't fall into poverty. There were some very strong measures. That's another thing, is that this crisis, in terms of your questions, Luigi, this crisis also showed nations for what they are. And I think we all reacted as expected. Swedes reacted as Swedes, Germans reacted as Germans, Moroccans reacted as Moroccans. So it's a good moment for us in terms of the social fabric of the nation, being together and solidarity. Morocco has created a special fund, an urgent fund, that has been funded by voluntary contributions by all Moroccans, companies, etc. And it's a quite significant amount. It's 3 percentage points of GDP. That is being used to support those informal workers I mentioned. So in terms of, the crisis as an engine for reform, the crisis as a togetherness force for countries to be able to sort of get together and do the appropriate reforms is an interesting, beyond of course the sadness of families that are losing people, but from a policy perspective, it's I think an important dynamic that is not to be lost. So basically the reforms that we were, and I think many countries actually, it's very true of the European Union, the reforms that we should have done 10 years ago, basically, and that we have not necessarily done are still to be done, basically, are still to be implemented. I can give you a couple of examples. You know, education, capacity to create an economy that is, you know, has a strong innovation sector. Morocco is a typical middle-income country that has, you know, needs to increase its productivity, increase the skill level of its stock of labor, but also, you know, have good education for new, you know, or new kids going out of the education system. So that's something we have been sort of lagging behind in terms of reforms. That has to be tackled very, very seriously. It takes serious work. It takes long-term commitment. It takes to stay very focused on the horizon. These are difficult reforms, and I think we're in better shape today to engage in those reforms. I think also in terms of the nation being together with an important spirit of solidarity. So there's also an important reform that has been talked about for a long time, which is reform of the fiscal system and the, you know, this sort of a more equal and more efficient, more redistributive fiscal policy and fiscal support, and also the subsidy schemes that we have that are not very well targeted. And that should be transformed in conditional cash transfers for the poorest households, as also to be reformed. It has been quite difficult because of the political economy around this subsidy. And I think now there is a momentum to do more. So basically everybody has been affected: firms, households, the budget, of course, fiscal policy, the monetary policy has to play its role. We don't have a full-fledged quantitative easing policy, but more sort of specific interventions from the central bank to make sure that credit flows. Not easy because there are issues in terms of the transmission mechanism from the bank, from banks to firms, from banks to also households. So that's something that has to be monitored very carefully to make sure we don't, you know, create permanent losses, permanent destructions of companies that are otherwise profitable. I mean, as economists, we really want, of course, you know, a sort of creative destruction where you have Schumpeterian entrepreneurs that emerge and the other inefficients that go bankrupt. But at the same time, because of short-term liquidity issues, we don't want companies and firms that are otherwise competitive to disappear. And it's very difficult to make sure that you have targeted, efficient interventions because we were not prepared to that. It was already a big challenge for Morocco to distribute these cash transfers I mentioned to informal and poor workers and households. It has been quite successful so far, but we didn't have a general system, a sort of, you know, registrar of all the poors, etc., to be able to convey efficiently support to them. So what I would say in terms of, in conclusion, I could elaborate a little bit more on the impact of the economy, of course, the spread, the external pressure, current account, etc. But my sense is that
we'll return to this. Time is.
Yeah. My sense is that basically we are all in this together, and we are all more vulnerable today than a couple of months ago, of course, because we have a sort of went into very strong fiscal expansion, and also monetary policy has done a lot. So I think we are all more vulnerable to another shock. Where it's going to come from, I don't know, but we can imagine that in the foreseeable future there will be additional shocks. So my sense is that building on this nation, you know, of this feeling that as nations, we are all sort of together in reacting to this crisis with the spirit of solidarity. There is a momentum to engage in serious reforms that have been lagging for a while. And my sense is that in Morocco, there is a good sort of outlook and prospects for that to happen. I'm not saying it's easy, but my sense is that there is the consciousness that we are vulnerable. There is also the psychological effect of this crisis, which you shouldn't underestimate at the individual level. It's a call for each one of us to think, to reflect on what we do. It's a pause, an imposed pause in terms of the way we live, that is fruitful for gathering energy, taking distance, and rethinking how we do normally. So I hope that decision makers, policy makers, will be able to take this opportunity so we'll come out of this crisis stronger. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Karim. I take the point of that, of course, the shock, the extremely strong shock can produce positive incentives to reforms that were long overdue, and hopefully this could be done in the spirit of even international cooperation. So that's a particularly important aspect that perhaps we can return into it. But on staying on the question of reforms and policy responses, perhaps I would turn back to Daniel with the question that we had received previously, that was on what kind of specific policy response could be put in place by governments, taking also into account the fact that you stress in your report transparency comes at the premium. So if you could highlight one or two areas which could be particularly important in this very moment to be built in the government policy responses to the crisis.
Thank you very much, Luigi, for the very important question. I think there's three sets of policy worth thinking in terms of the sequencing without delay. And these three policy areas are about the immediate needs. So the first one is the public health interventions. Clearly, until there's a vaccine, there's going to have to be some social distancing type of framework in societies across the world in order to try to minimize the loss of lives. Now, it's very difficult to predict and to give very precise advice about the extent or magnitude or intensity of the lockdowns or social distancing policies that can be implemented in different countries. In poorer settings, where there's a lot of informally employed, vulnerable households that can't afford to be locked down for extended periods of time because they literally live hand to mouth. And so there's no way out of this but to have smart social distancing policies and to invest in parallel as much as possible, both in the existing public health infrastructure and looking forward to try to set up in a hopeful near future the infrastructure that's going to be needed to keep expanding testing and eventually the distribution of therapeutics that come online and the vaccine. And this takes time. We won't build such infrastructure even in countries like Tunisia or even Egypt from one day to the other. In countries that are more fortunate, like in the Emirates or in Saudi, they're much more advanced. They have pre-existing redundancy in their health system, which has prepared them to absorb the shock more efficiently. So that's the first area, public health. It's very difficult to give very precise, specific advice in those areas because so context specific, not only across countries, but even within countries. The situation of the public health system in Tunis is very different than in southern Tunis. In Cairo is very different than in Upper Egypt. And so one has to take into account that the source of livelihoods is very different, and therefore the public health interventions need to vary. The second area is this, what we're calling disaster relief, to maintain a minimum level of consumption. This is support to vulnerable households, and Morocco has laid a path, as Karim was describing, in terms of quickly being able to roll out a system for disbursement of cash assistance for vulnerable and informally employed populations. This is not a minor feat. In some countries, our best guess estimates of the size of the informally employed labor force can exceed 70% of the labor force. So this is a very difficult issue that most of the Western world, and even in China, does not have. In China, they have these problems in some areas, in rural areas, but China has the advantage where digital technologies have huge levels of penetration and of use. MENA has a lot of penetration of mobile telephony, but they've never been, there isn't the infrastructure, for example, of digital payments that can be adapted in the short run to channel resources to those that most need it. And these, I cannot overemphasize how important it is to roll out this assistance in cash and transfers unconditionally almost to vulnerable households in order to induce a vast share of the national population, citizenry in the region, to stay at home. If assistance doesn't get there, they cannot stay home because they have to eat. Otherwise, we're going to have widespread localized famine in poor areas of the countries. And the third area that is for immediate attention is indeed the area of transparency. This has two dimensions. One has to do with the sharing, open sharing of information, data, the scientific evidence about the spread, about the testing, about mortality rates, in order to enable our leaders to clearly communicate and explain what's going on with the vast majority of our citizenry. It is very hard to get compliance with even mild programs of social distancing if people don't trust the state or the public sector. And many MENA countries here have a pent-up deficit of societal trust in the public sector. And now we cannot wait any longer. If there's one clear lesson of what has happened around the world, is that clear, transparent communication with the citizenry, regardless of levels of education, regardless of ideology, regardless of territorial localization, is fundamental for both protecting lives and livelihoods, because it makes the social and policy and economic policy responses more efficient. We hoped that this push for greater transparency and open communication between the state, the public sectors, and the broader citizenry will flourish in the months and the years ahead, so that we can have more informed, fact-based, evidence-based public discussions with think tanks, with academics, with the best minds around the world, not only national, about what are the best reform packages, social policies, macro financial and fiscal policies, even in the aftermath of this crisis. We cannot stress, one cannot exaggerate the importance of transparency in the current juncture, and we must acknowledge that in the recent history of the region, we have failed in the transparency angle. Thank you.
Thank you, Daniel. That's a very important point. Also, the fact that a debate is much needed on what are the appropriate response, and that needs to be, of course, widespread and evidence-based. I think that's, in addition, I think it's broader than the issues that you have highlighted that pertain to the MENA region. I think it is clearly an issue for all of us. Perhaps if I can turn back to Dr. Fahad, I have a couple of questions on the energy area. One is if you can take away the possible, hopefully we're not going to have it, but impact from a second wave of the pandemics. What are the downside risks to the oil price in 2020 that you feel we are not looking at them at the moment? And if we are not capable of anticipating, then they could also perhaps have another negative impact on the V-shaped recovery that we hopefully have. And then a second question, which I highlighted before also, I think you stressed the resilience of renewable, even in these particular circumstances, and also gas and nuclear, clean energy in general. I think many analysts seem to agree that the trends we have been seeing before the crisis seem to remain on course. So how do you assess that, and what is your take on that?
Thank you. Very, very important questions. I think on the first question, it's if I would add another component to any downside risk to oil prices, it would be the ability or the lack of ability of countries to recover from the current crisis. And as I mentioned in my introductory remark, it's easy to say that we will restart the economy and open economy. Opening a business is going to be way relatively. It's not. I'm not going to say it's easy, but it's way easier relative to reinstating confidence in the system among consumers. Remember, confinement and curfew in many countries and restriction of movements and travels been with us for the last 2 to 3 months. You may allow travel on principle, but whether there will be consumers that are demanding that service within the next few months, that's another story and another difficulty. So restarting aggregate demand is going to be relatively harder than opening and restarting businesses. So that's the second probably risk factor. If we see, and we always, in the T20, T20 is Think 20, which is one of the engagement groups under the G20. And we initiated a new task force to focus on COVID-19 and on implications of COVID-19, not only on the economy and on energy, but also on social aspects. And there is a risk of that we're not paying attention to, which is the soft side of the implications of COVID-19 on consumer confidence and ability of consumers to go back to previous businesses, to previous behavior. So that's on the first question. On the second question, so things are always relative. The reason why we see stronger growth in renewable and low carbon sources of fuel this year is because two major factors. One, on the renewable side, there is a huge capacity improvement, investments coming from last year into operational this year, and that's why we see a 5% growth. On nuclear, we're seeing probably a decline of 2%. So there is still a contraction there, but if you compare it to other sources of fuel like coal or oil, it's relatively lower impacted. Whether this will continue or not, it depends, I think, on two factors. One is what the governments will do in terms of their priorities for directing their spending. And two, whether consumer behavior following the pandemic will continue to be the same in terms of lower demand on either travel, low vehicle transportation, be it on land transportation or air or sea. So that could be a major factor in determining what the direction would be for low carbon fuel in the future.
Thank you, Dr. Fay. Now I have a question on targeted social protection. I think, Karim, you made the example of Morocco, and I think this is particularly important, as mentioned also by Daniel, the question of informality and the informal sector and the necessity to protect workers from the informal sector. I mean, can perhaps we look at specific policies, what works and what doesn't? I mean, and perhaps Daniel also has some perhaps broader view through the region. Karim and then Daniel, if you can jump in on this.
Well, I can tell you what we've been doing here. There was, of course, the formal sector is about 4.5 million. Morocco is, for those who don't know, is about 35 million people. We have, 4.5 out of the workforce. If you include the labor force, is about 11 million people, 1 million unemployed globally, plus 4.5 in the formal sector. 5, let's push it at 5 with the public formal sector. The broad sense 5.5, which are identified that they have social security number. So those they got support through their companies, but there was a support from the fund I mentioned, direct support on their payroll, if you wish. The second one that is a bit less problematic is the Moroccans that have access to a medical insurance scheme for the poor, which are known and identified as such. They have a card. We're talking, I think, 8.5 million people, something of the like. It's per household. There could be overlap with the others, by the way. You can be in that medical scheme and also being a formal sector that is at the minimum wage, let's say. And then we have people in the informal sector, about 4 million, that have basically have a day-to-day sort of income, which are very difficult for them to smooth their consumption over time, low savings, etc. There was a system that was invented on the spot, if you wish, through mobile phones and identification of people, and then they had to go to banking agencies and these cash transfer agencies with the money in cash, basically. We didn't have the fintech like some countries, Kenya or Nigeria, can have. So that's where you see that resilience is important, and thinking of these issues, and that's why I mentioned the necessity, a very important reform for a country like Morocco to have a conditional cash transfer system where. And we spend a lot in subsidies, but in a very efficient way, untargeted subsidies on oil, particularly gas, for cooking gas, which can be a couple of percentage points of GDP, depending on the price of oil and gas on the global market, which is very inefficient. That was initially, something to reduce the depletion of forest, for cooking oil, but then it was distorted and used as a source of energy in agriculture for pumping water, or in houses just to warm up water, or in hammams, this collective public bath where consume a lot of, they burn energy to warm up water. So I think it's a wake-up call, and people have realized, oh, how can we help? You know, even if you want to help, you need to have the, you know, the militaries, they know this very well. You can think of any strategy is execution. So if you don't, you cannot execute, you have a problem. So that's very important. And I'm not too worried about the informal sector to restart, you know, as soon as we let people go back to their normal activity. I'm worried about those workers at the, you know, 2-3 times above the poverty line, basically minimum wage and 2-3 times the minimum wage, let's say, that are working in restaurants, in the tourism sector, in the broad sense. And some of the workers, the formal workers, we need to worry about them, also unskilled formal workers that are working in light manufacturing activities that have been affected. So it's a very complex, you know, set of effects that you have here, but it's not necessarily the poor, the informal sector that is going to be the most affected. I mean, we have to support them and to give them a lifeline during this time, but then, you know, those unskilled workers in the formal sector are also to be you know, to be helped, and we have to help for the transition, help the companies. It's a very sort of uncharted territory for public policy, and that's where I join Daniel. That's what we do in our think tank, but also at the university. It's really to introduce this culture of evidence-based policy making. And we're not talking only about randomized surveys, I mean, and tests. We're talking really evidence-based, whatever the toolkit of public policy analysis in the broad sense. It can be very qualitative, it can be quantitative. It has also a very strong lead to participatory democracy, what you called in the US deliberative democracy, where you have to consult people because sometimes they know, and most of the time, they know better than your models. You know? Just, you know, in region, and it has to be region specific, you know. That's another reform I didn't mention, which is fundamental for a country like Morocco, is to be successful in the implementation, in the decentralization mechanism, you know, in the what we call here regionalization. It's the devolution of power and in terms of the democratic institution, but also the administration, you know, that is quite centralized in Rabat, that has to go, you know, locally, and which has been very difficult to achieve, very strong resistances from the center here in Rabat. And this notion of innovation, you know, I'm sure if you ask, and I will conclude on that, I see you becoming impatient, Luigi, but that's very important. It's linked to the transparency that Daniel was calling for. And it's not transparency, it's not competition for the sake of it. It's also for innovation, to open space, you know, for society. It's not just technocratic. And I'm sure if you had asked, you know, a couple of Moroccans, young Moroccans, let's say you gave them a year to come up with a very efficient system that use the new technologies to transfer this money, they would have done it, you know, but nobody asked them. And at the same time, we don't have the infrastructure, the general infrastructure to promote innovation for them to come up with that, because no policymaker can come up with these ideas, and that's where competition is interesting, and, you know, level playing field and discipline and efficient regulation in many sectors, where you want this to, you know, this enormous energy of our young population to contribute to the future of their country by giving them the space to innovate. I think that is something that we are also, I hope, realizing with this crisis and the needed response to produce as a collectively as a nation that is together, and which I insist is very, very important, and is fundamental to conduct complex reforms where you need confidence and trust. You can achieve all the reforms if you have confidence and trust in general in the society, but not polarized nations where it's very complex to do anything, basically. Thank you. Sorry to have been a bit too long.
Thank you, Karim. No, you have a strong supporter for these ideas in myself. So, but I just wanted to also be able to address other issues. So if Daniel wanted to jump in on the issue of targeted social protection throughout MENA and countries, which countries seem to be able to address it in a better way, you probably have the overview, Daniel.
Very important question. I must say that I couldn't agree more with what Karim was saying. In terms of the targeting in the middle of a crisis, in a sense, many countries are coming to the game with a big gap because most of the countries didn't have pre-existing targeting mechanisms, precisely because the social protection system relied on general subsidies, usually in-kind subsidies such as energy subsidies, rather than targeting. So unlike, say, countries like Mexico or other countries in Latin America, the mechanisms for distributing targeted transfers to the most vulnerable populations that live hand to mouth is a huge undertaking, but it can be done. MENA, as I mentioned earlier, has one advantage, say, over sub-Saharan Africa, which is that mobile telephony has a much higher penetration rate even among the poor. The problem is that we're behind sub-Saharan Africa when it comes to digital payments, because if we had widespread use of mobile money accounts, then you could use those accounts to make deposits financed by public debt during the crisis. So the amazing thing that Morocco has been working on is that they're setting up the targeting mechanism as well as mobilizing the national resources, creating fiscal space through a broad societal response to the crisis, and then to challenge them. It is really remarkable that they can do so quickly. Now, the truth is that in Morocco, there have been a lot of technical thinking about these reforms to the social protection system well in advance, but it can be done, and I hope that there's more learning region-wide based on the Moroccan experience, and it should be generalized in our opinion. And there's no other way to go about it except via the use of mobile telephony, because with large shares of the population being informal, there's no real informational base for targeting. I was going to say something about the risk of escalating poverty and transforming, especially the developing emerging markets of the region, into much poorer societies. This is a real risk. And next Tuesday night, Washington time, we will be publishing on our website for the first time our MENA crisis tracker that provides some back of the envelope calculations about the potential increases, proportional percentage increases in poverty rates that is a function of the poverty elasticity with respect to GDP and the expected GDP losses as the crisis has gone by. I don't think I have time to share the screen, though I would love to share those back of the envelope calculations, which will be made public next Tuesday night, Washington time, in our website of the Office of the Chief Economist for MENA of the World Bank Group. But the numbers are staggering. The numbers are staggering. And these estimates rely on poverty GDP elasticities that assume that the shock will not affect the distribution of consumption across households. So they're what technocrats, economists, poverty economists call inequality distributional neutral elasticities. That's a huge assumption when we know that both from the public health side as well as from the economic side, in many countries, it's been the most vulnerable that are the most exposed both to the fatal consequences of the spread and to the socio-economic losses. And so I can't overemphasize how important it is what Corinne was just talking about. And one cannot exaggerate, cannot be over exaggerating the importance of transparency. Because if society does not trust what the central governments and the authorities and the political leaders are trying to accomplish, both with the social distancing policy, other public health intervention, and the socio-economic disaster relief policies, these can go on for a long, long time, up to a point that it doesn't matter how many people have cell phones, it'll be too late. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Daniel. I see the clock is ticking. We have still 5 minutes to go, but I have an important question, perhaps as the last question, open to all who want to intervene, and it's looking at opportunities. There is a lot of talk about the impact on globalization that pandemic will have in the long run, and many people say that certainly that could have an impact in shortening the supply line, reshoring production operations away from China back to the Mediterranean courtyard, if you want, for enterprises in Europe and in the MENA region in the Mediterranean. So I just was wondering, what is your take on that in terms of potential opportunities for all the countries in the MENA region, and what is there a role for say smart industrial policies that can trigger that on the two shores of the Mediterranean? I mean, that's also calls into question what Europe can do for that.
Yeah. Sir?
Yes, Dr. Fad.
Okay, so I think that's a very interesting, point. There is always within crisis, there is always some opportunities that we should look at. Maybe in the darkest of times, we should always focus on the half full of the cup and see the emerging signs. I think from my perspective, while this pandemic create a massive challenge to the way we live, the way we manage our economies, it also create an opportunity for the global community to show solidarity and united, which we start seeing during the meetings of the G20 here in Saudi Arabia, especially in early March with the extraordinary G20 Leaders Summit and the statement that was issued. And including within that statement, there were a number of initiatives that are being rolled over as we advance. One of them is the agreement that was signed by international organizations and many advanced countries on May 4th, which raises funds for finding a vaccine for the virus, but also supporting less fortunate countries. So I think the role of multilateralism and the coordinated international measure as a result of this pandemic is very important, and it is an opportunity. In addition to that, I think it is an opportunity to reform many of the domestic economic policies. And we've seen that here in Saudi Arabia. Karim have talked about it. Daniel talked about it as well. And there is a lot of thinking about creating fiscal stimulus, scaling up transfer measure or cash transfer measures, improving the social protection, reviewing the tax system, and also introducing a lower interest rate to support economies as they recover, allowing SMEs to have access to credit above and beyond what they had before, just to make them live through the crisis. And most importantly, there should be a serious thinking about restoring global supply chain and revisiting the slowdown in global trade, the so-called global trade war. That should be revisited in light of this pandemic, as we realize that we, as a global community, depend on one another. There should be a revisit of access to medical supplies. We should look at these issues, especially for developing and less fortunate countries. Protection for wages, managing the significant increase in unemployment is also an opportunity for the countries to introduce the reform within their economies. Thank you.
Thank you. Karim? Yeah. Anybody? Karim or Daniel?
Okay.
Yeah.
Yes, maybe one question was there about education and how we did. I'm also a dean of at a university, so we went digital overnight, and we couldn't believe we could do it. But what I can tell you is that it has unlocked a psychological blockage in people's mind and in the professor, also the faculty. And now we have decided to move 30%, 30, of all our courses online on average. Actually, we are still assessing, but it's of course a university, but it seems to be much better. And as a father, also my son Walid, who is watching, I say hello, by the way. He has also went through that in Canada where he studies. So I think for the education system, the digital will play a stronger role. And let us see, but first assessment we have, it has improved quality. The question was about high school and of course younger children, where inequality and social backgrounds still play a fundamental role at these early ages in society. And I think policymakers have to look into this very carefully and make sure that we don't lose, it's not so long in the end, but we don't lose this generation, and they don't have. So again, these are very detailed policies. They should be, decentralized. They should be at the closest level of the population. They cannot be dealt from a capital city in any country. So on your points, I would like to emphasize only one point, Luigi, which is very important and dear to our heart. The work of our think tank here is the relation with the European Union. And with Africa in general, and of course with Morocco in particular. I think it's a fantastic opportunity to retool and rethink our relation. There's ongoing discussions, and I saw a question from Adel, which he has put from Chatham House here, about the reconfiguration of global value chains and the demand for security that will come up from populations. Yes, of course. There will be a demand for security in the broad sense from their government, where they will maybe relocate some of the productions, and that's where you talked about smart industrial policy. How smart can it get? It can be very smart if policymakers just provide the framework and the appropriate environment, particularly the trade rules and particularly rules of origins, etc. There's a lot to do within the MENA region and with the African continent as a whole. But this needs, political leadership and the space. And I think institutions like us, think tanks, academia, international institutions, of course, the private sector, for the most part of it, can do something. It makes a lot of sense. We've discovered that, something that can be optimal from the point of view of, let's say, a firm is not necessarily optimal from the point of view of society. It's a typical sort of public good. And that security of a certain number of goods, according to the population demands, I mean, this is why we policymakers are here, in the end, is something that they want to be sort of guaranteed by the government. So I think we should work that together, both sides of the Mediterranean. And there's many, many improvements to be made. we need leadership. From our standpoint as a think tank and a university, you can count on us. Our commitment, our passion, our energy, our researchers in finding collective solutions in open dialogues, respects, and tolerance, which I think is even more important. The capacity to dialogues, super dialogue, that makes us understand each other, is a fundamental dimension, I think, of this world, and particularly one of you mentioned it, where the multilateralism has been challenged by some superpowers, and for us, in a way, we're bystanders, innocent bystanders watching all this in front of our eyes. I think there's something to do together around the Mediterranean. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Karim. Daniel, one last word.
Okay, well, thank you very much. It's been an excellent panel. I've learned a lot from Karim and Dr. Al-Turki, so I very much appreciate the invitation. I'd like to end with a couple of words. One, on the idea of smart industrial policies. It suffices to say for now that it's a topic that's close to my intellectual and professional heart. I've spent decades doing research on R&D policy, digital economy, labor markets, and the like. But it suffices to say that even the smartest, most well-designed, well-intentioned, smart industrial policies can be very costly when the underlying economic system suffers from distortions. For example, if you have a dysfunctional electricity sector, or you have big state-owned monopolies in mobile telephony that raise the costs unnecessarily of doing business in urban, especially in rural areas, you need the amount of fiscal resources that you have to mobilize in order to succeed in setting up, say, industrial parks or something like that is much higher. Needless to say that if you have a misaligned, appreciated exchange rates, then it becomes really expensive to have smart export promotion policies. So that's on the industrial policy side. On the regional and globalization issues, there's a similar issue here about sequencing without delay. Clearly, we need to revisit at some point this business of the killing of the world trading system through 1,000 cuts at some point. But in the immediate, and we need to start thinking now about it, but there are urgent issues that are emerging because of a lack, or because of a leadership vacuum in the global economy. And there's a real chance that many countries, especially the poorest among us, that will suffer from beggar thy neighbor policies on the medical equipment, PPEs, but also the vaccines and the therapeutics as they come online, and food. There's a real need for some sort of global coordinating leadership to prevent hoarding among the countries that have the productive capacity of agriculture and food items, as well as of medical equipment and eventually vaccines and therapeutics, that they will hoard them, keep them to themselves, lowering domestic prices, but raising global prices of food and therapeutics and vaccines to heights that will make it unaffordable for the vast portions of the global population, which will mean that the virus will keep circulating longer than it has to, and B, that we will have another pandemic of famines around the world. And it would be better if we didn't have the current vacuum of global leadership to coordinate countries in order to minimize the temptation to pursue beggar thy neighbor policies. But in the absence of that, it would be great if emerging powers, economic powers such as Saudi Arabia, other members of the G20, would take the leadership mantle and work together, both with the WHO and the WTO and the European Union, to try to bring about much needed global leadership and coordination in the areas of food supplies and medical equipment supplies. Thank you.
Thank you, Daniel. I think on this note, on call for more cooperations amongst important actors, I think we come to a close to a very interesting panel. I like to thank the panelists, Dr. Fahd Al-Turki, Dr. Karim Al-Anawi, and Dr. Daniel Lederman for the very great contributions they have done to the extremely lively debate. And thank you. And I hope we will have more opportunities to discuss these important issues. Thank you very much.
It's been a pleasure. Thank you.
Pleasure.